The point of all of this is Lincoln used these. Lincoln did this. He imposed martial law and he suspended the writ of habeas corpus in the border states. Look on your map. On the part that has, and I'm sorry if you don't have one, just look on with someone else or you'll just have to listen. Sorry. If you look on the map, you'll notice that on the map with the different shaded states, those are the 4 border states. So Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and Kentucky, and eventually West Virginia, are the 4 border slave states. They're slave states, but they stay in the Union the entire war. One of the main reasons they stayed in the Union is Lincoln imposed these. So Lincoln he imposed martial law and he suspended the writ of habeas corpus in the border states. What he would do is, especially in Maryland, he rounded up, he had the military round up pro-Confederate people who were for the Confederacy, and throw them in prison without, all their constitutional rights were violated, without, any kind of getting the right to see a judge or anything. He did this. Why did he have to do that in Maryland? More than anything, and I'm sorry if you're running out of room, I really needed to give more room for you guys to write notes, and I apologize for that. Tried to save paper, believe it or not. Why did Lincoln suspend in Maryland? Why was it really important that Maryland not secede from the Union? Why was Lincoln like, we'll do anything to keep Maryland from seceding and breaking away from the Union? Go ahead, Jessica.
It was the way that they got to Washington, D.C.
Right. If Maryland seceded, Washington, D.C. would be surrounded. So he had to keep Maryland in the Union, because if the slave state Maryland seceded and joined the Confederacy, Washington, D.C. would have been surrounded completely. The Union capital would have been surrounded by the Confederate states. That could not happen. You can't have your capital surrounded by the enemy. So he did whatever it took, no matter how many rights of people were violated. That's why some saw him as a tyrant. Tyrant Lincoln. All right, moving on then to next point. Number 48, the Confederacy was hoping to get diplomatic recognition from Great Britain and France. What does that mean? You don't have to put this down, but just so you understand, that means that they would be recognized as their own separate country and not as like part of the United States that was rebelling against them, but they were their own separate country. And of course, if they got diplomatic recognition, what would follow from that? If they got diplomatic recognition, then Great Britain and France would take their side in the war, probably. And there's no way the North could win. And this is the biggest thing they were counting on, more than anything, that eventually Great Britain and France would intervene and take their side because they needed cotton from the South. So, that never happened. Does anyone know why Great Britain and France never took the side of the South and never gave them diplomatic recognition, never actually recognized them as their own country, which is the first thing that would have to happen? Go ahead, Julia.
Did they have alternate sources to get their cotton?
They got cotton from other places. So one reason is they got cotton from other places, especially Egypt and India, other parts of their empire, like Egypt and India. Why else? Yeah, Abby?
Like they had so much of it from like the South that it's when
they had so much of it from the bumper 1860 crop. There was a bumper crop in 1860. A bumper crop in 1860. And they had so much cotton from that bumper crop that when the war started, they had all this cotton in warehouses, so they didn't need to go to the South to get it. Julia? Mm-hmm. And the Emancipation Proclamation really sold a lot of people. So the Emancipation Proclamation, when Lincoln actually frees the slaves, a lot of people in Great Britain and France are like, hey, we like the North better than the South, especially since a lot of them had read Uncle Tom's Cabin before that. And then another one was the fact that the South never won a major battle on Union soil. Lee wanted to go into Union soil and win a major battle, and if they had done that, France and Great Britain probably would have taken their side, but the South never won. They won a lot of battles, but they never won a battle on Union soil. Number 49, when the war started, what was Lincoln's initial purpose for the war? When the war started, Jamie?
Keep the Union going.
To save the Union, right. Lincoln, the purpose of the war when it started in 1861 was to save the Union. In fact, Lincoln was against freeing the slaves early in the war. Why was Lincoln against freeing the slaves early on in the war? Julia?
Because when they get the border states to go on to the other side.
Exactly. He wanted to keep the border slave states in the Union. So he wanted to keep the border slave states in the Union. And he didn't want to upset Northern voters. He didn't want to upset Northern voters who didn't want the free slaves coming north to take their jobs away. So not only did he not want to lose the support of the 4 loyal border slave states, he wanted to make sure he didn't lose the support of Northern voters. Because Northern voters realize you free the slaves, and if you're like in a state right on the border, like you're right near a slave state, it's not that long. You just cross the Ohio River and then you're in a free state. The fear was, look, they're going to come north and they're going to take our jobs away if they're free. So we'd rather have them stay as slaves. So he didn't want to upset Northern voters. So he was against freeing the slaves when the war started. The Battle of Antietam, number 50, the Battle of Antietam was, first of all, it's in Maryland. Lee actually goes and tries to win a battle on Union soil. They really thought that if they went into Maryland and won, Maryland would secede and maybe the war would be over and Washington, D.C. would be surrounded and all that stuff. So he went into Maryland, and the result of the battle put down was a military tie, and the single bloodiest day of the war. It was a military tie and the single bloodiest day of the war. Military tie and the single bloodiest day of the war. It's a great and terrible day in American history. We ended up having to retreat back into, without winning. I mean, he didn't really lose, but he didn't win, so he had to retreat back into the South, or back into the Confederacy. And it's significant for 2 reasons. Anyone know why this battle is so significant in world history, not just U.S. history? It got Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Because Lincoln was looking for something that would be perceived as some kind of victory. He didn't want to seem desperate. And this was kind of perceived as a victory, even though it was really a tie. So it spurred Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And it caused France and Great Britain to delay any plans to recognize the Confederacy. It caused France and Great Britain to delay any plans that they had to recognize the Confederacy. It caused France and Great Britain to delay any plans they had to recognize the Confederacy. There's a lot of what-ifs in history. Just let me give you a really quick one. And you don't have to put any of this down, but I want you to learn from this. The reason why the Union was able to hold off Lee at Antietam is they knew Lee's battle plans. How did they know Lee's battle plans? Because wrapped around 3 cigars that were on the ground that Union soldiers found, that were carelessly dropped at a Confederate camp earlier, they found, wrapped around these cigars, they found his battle plans. One really careless mistake. Had they not had those battle plans, you could argue that the South would have won the Battle of Antietam. Had the South won the Battle of Antietam, they probably would have had France and Great Britain on their side eventually. Had that happened, the North probably would have lost, and all of world history would have been totally set in like a different path, different trajectory. But because of this one careless mistake, all of world history was changed. So this is kind of something to think about. You think that small little things don't mean anything, like dropping something? Well, in this case, it meant a lot. Moving on to the Emancipation Proclamation. What slaves were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation? What slaves were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation? Go ahead, Olivia.
Wasn't it only those in the South, not in the border states?
Only the slaves under Confederate control. There's going to be a lot to write down here, so just be patient with me. A lot to write down. And then the next ones are going to be pretty quick, but only slaves under Confederate control. Only those slaves in Confederate-controlled areas. So therefore, what slaves were not freed? Specifically, what slaves were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation Act? The ones in the loyal border states. It only freed slaves under Confederate control. The next thing to know is that Lincoln issued this as a war measure. I mean, he couldn't constitutionally free the slaves. The Supreme Court in Dred Scott had said slaves are property, they're protected for Fifth Amendment property rights. But he could do this as a war measure. As Commander-in-Chief, he could say, this is needed to win the war. As Commander-in-Chief. We're going to injure the Confederacy. Now, if you really think about it, the Emancipation Proclamation seems meaningless because if Lincoln says all the slaves in the Confederate territory are forever free, the Confederates are not going to go, okay, Mr. Lincoln, we're going to free our slaves. I mean, they're at war with the Union, right? They're not going to free their slaves just because the president of the enemy country, the United States, said all the slaves are free. So it really didn't free any slaves right away because they were in Confederate control and the Confederates were going to free them. But there's three reasons why the Emancipation Proclamation was significant. And I'll give you those three reasons. It changed the purpose of the war. It was now a war to end slavery, not just to save the Union. So it changed the purpose of the war into a war to end slavery, not merely to save the Union. It changed the purpose of the war into a war to end slavery. It strengthened the moral cause of the Union. It gave soldiers something more to be fighting for. So strengthen the moral cause of the Union. If I'm a Wisconsin soldier at Shiloh in Tennessee, I'm not thinking, I'm doing this to save the Union. I'm like, I want to stay alive. I don't want to die. You're not going to be like, oh, I'm doing this to save the Union. But it's a much nobler thing. I'm doing this to free human beings in bondage. I'm doing this, I mean, it really is a bigger thing to be fighting for than an abstract concept like save the Union. And then a third one is thousands of Jubilant slaves fled to invading Union armies. So it did, the slaves found out about this, and they're like, if there's a Union soldier nearby or if there are any Union people nearby, they ran, because they now knew if they get to safety under Union protection, they are forever free. They'll never can be slaves again because Lincoln has issued this. They are forever free. So a lot of slaves ran to Union lines, especially after hearing this. All right, number 52, black soldiers in the Union Army. Mostly non-combat. They were relegated to lower-level non-combat duties. So they were relegated to lower-level support duties. Non-combat duties. Although some did distinguish themselves in combat, they were allowed in combat eventually, but at first they weren't. You should know that when they did get into combat, they served in segregated units under white officers. They were an all-black units under white officers. And you should know that they were paid less than whites. Black privates, black soldiers were paid $10 a week instead, or $10 a month, I believe, instead of $13 a month. So black privates were paid less than white privates. Maybe, I don't know if it was a week or a month, but $10 versus $13. Number 53, the Battle of Gettysburg. If you turn your map to the other side, you'll see in Pennsylvania, go up to where Pennsylvania is, far upper right-hand corner of the map. It says July 1863, Gettysburg. This is the turning point of the war and a major Union victory in Pennsylvania. Lee goes into Union territory again, partly just because his troops are starving and he needs food. So it's a major Union victory in Pennsylvania. Major Union victory is seen as a turning point in the war because after that it's all downhill for the South. And the famous part of the battle is the third day of the battle known as Pickett's Charge. And does anyone know what that is? Maybe you've been to Gettysburg Battlefield, or you've seen the movie Gettysburg, or you've got family that's interested in the Civil War. There's a lot of addicts out there. There's people that go to reenactments like every month. I mean, we've got them in Wisconsin. Pickett's charge was General Lee ordered 15,000 troops, 15,000 Confederate troops to basically attack the Union at Cemetery Ridge. It was this kind of elevated land, and the Union had the high ground. And it was this charge of 15,000 men over this wide open field, slowly going uphill. So it's like a really slow incline. You stand at Cemetery Ridge, it's not like you're looking down like this, it's like you're looking down, it goes up, and they were just mowed down. It was a really bad mistake by General Lee, and the Confederates were just mowed down. The Union started opening fire, and by the time they were close enough to be shot at, I mean, they were just mowed down. And a lot of them had to retreat. And it was all downhill for the South. After that, the South strategy is just to kill as many people as possible so the North will get tired of the war. And that's why the war lasts for 2 more years, because their strategy is, okay, come down here, take us over, we'll kill so many of you that you'll give up eventually. Of course, Grant's not a quitter, so Grant wasn't going to give up. We're going to go to the Vicksburg. Vicksburg was a famous fort, Vicksburg, Mississippi, on the Mississippi River. When Vicksburg fell, why is that significant? What was the Union able to do? And if you look on your map at Vicksburg, Mississippi, you can see Vicksburg there, May through July 1863. When Vicksburg fell, that was significant because the Union gained control of, pretty easy, the Union gained control of, Becca, the Mississippi River. And if you look on your map, when they gained control of the Mississippi River, they split the Confederacy in 2. So after Vicksburg falls, they gain control of the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy in 2. Because Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana were now cut off from the rest of the Confederacy. And if they were going to send food to Mississippi and Alabama and other places, they can't because the Union controls the river. And they can't cross it. So they basically cut the Confederacy in 2. Moving on then to New York City draft riots. These were Irish that rioted. This is the biggest riot in U.S. history, bigger than any of the riots over Ferguson that we've had, or even the riots of the 60s. 119 people died. Many have suspected it was a lot more. It was mainly the Irish immigrants, Irish mobs that were protesting the draft. Irish mobs were protesting the draft. Official death toll was 119, but many have suspected that that's really a lower number than the actual people that died. And why were the Irish protesting the draft? They hated the draft for 2 reasons. Go ahead, Jamie.
Because the poor people were the ones that were fighting them, because you could actually buy your way out of it.
Right. They hated how the rich could buy their way out of it. They hated, and they attacked the wealthy. The Irish attacked the wealthy in New York during these riots because they hated these rich. They called them $300 men. What's wrong with you? Did your daddy buy your way out of the war? And then they started attacking them. Go get them. Go after these rich people that don't have to fight, whose daddy bought their way out of the war. And then the second thing is they didn't want to fight for the freedom of black slaves that would come north and take their jobs away. They didn't want to fight for the freedom of black slaves that would come north and take away their jobs. And therefore they attacked blacks. They hated blacks. They blamed blacks for the war. So the Irish attacked blacks and hung some of them during the New York City draft riots. And then the U.S. soldiers killed a whole bunch of them. Eventually the U.S. Army had to be brought in and they shot at the rioters and stuff like that. Copperheads, who were Copperheads? Copperheads were, and it's named after the poisonous snake known as a copperhead that, you don't have to put this down, that strikes without a warning rattle. These were the extreme peace Democrats who wanted to end the fighting. Extreme peace Democrats who wanted to end the fighting even if it meant risking the Union. So extreme peace Democrats that wanted to end the fighting even if it meant risking the Union. They hated Lincoln. They called him an Illinois ape. They likened Lincoln to a gorilla with his abnormally long legs and arms, and They hated him, and they basically were like, enough dead. We have enough dead bodies, enough. This war should end. How many more dead bodies do we need of Union 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds? How many more do we need? And they wanted to end the war even if it meant that the Union would never get back together. They were a minority, but just so you realize they were in the North. And then Sherman's March to the Sea. William Sherman, the March to the Sea was from Atlanta, Georgia. So after burning Atlanta, Georgia, and this is late in 1864, Sherman marched with his troops, and they lived off the land. And they created a 60-mile wide path of destruction to the sea. So Sherman, his troops lived off the land, and they had this 60-mile wide path of destruction, and they engaged in total war. And what is total war again? So they basically lived off the land, and they engaged in total war as they marched from Atlanta to Savannah in the 60-mile wide path. What's total war? Go ahead, Becca.
Destroy everything and kill everybody.
Yeah. Exactly. Kill everything, destroy everything. They destroyed livestock. And they went, and the Union soldiers got out of control. They went into the rich mansions, and they broke everything they saw, unless it was valuable to keep, and they took all the jewelry and, stuffed themselves full of, they pillaged, they looted, and then destroyed property. And the significance of this is huge. It's significant because, number one, it increased Confederate desertions. When this happened, a lot of Southern boys were like, I'm done. I'm done. Robert E. Lee, go ahead. You can go on your own now. I'm done. It increased Confederate desertions. And it led to long-lasting hatred towards the North. It led to long-lasting hatred towards the North. I mean, there's people down there. You see a Confederate flag in Wisconsin, there's all kinds of stereotypes, redneck or whatever. I don't buy into stereotypes anyway, but people have that. But you see a Confederate flag down there. There's people down there that the war hasn't really ended yet. Their great-great-grandparents hated the Yankees. Their great-grandparents hated the Yankees. Their grandparents did. They pass it on from generation to generation. If you don't believe that, there is a baseball player in Georgia that transferred he was taking AP US History in Georgia, transferred into my class in the 1990s, and raised his hand and said, Mr. Britton, they still have I Hate Sherman bumper stickers in Georgia. There's still I Hate Sherman bumper stickers down there. He was hated for what they basically just destroy everything in this path of destruction. Appomattox, what happened at Appomattox number 58? What happened at Appomattox? Go ahead, Tam.
Captured General Lee.
Yeah, this is where Lee surrendered to Grant. This is considered this big surrender that ends the war. So Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. So Robert E. Lee, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. And here's what's significant. Grant did not allow his soldiers to celebrate. In fact, put down that Grant let the Confederates, this is the Union General, Grant let the Confederates return to their homes. Grant let the Confederates return to their homes and basically ordered, they got to keep their horses and mules, and he even ordered his men to feed them. They were starving. There was just starvation throughout the South. Everything was in ruins, and he ordered his men to feed the Confederates, and basically told, because they were now our brothers again. We were now one country again. Grant realized that. And he ordered his men to feed the Confederates. All right, and then we just have 4 more points. You guys have been great this morning. We're going to do, I think it's 72 through 75. And this is going to seem a little bit out of context, but they're important facts that you should know. I just know that there's not going to be time to cover them in class. So, number 72, the Tenure of Office Act. And this is during Reconstruction. This is during Congressional Reconstruction. You don't have to put this down, but we'll be learning That's where they put military troops in the South to basically force the South to change and change its ways and not, treat black people as inferiors and try to kill them and all that. And this is where the KKK forms as a terrorist organization to basically prevent Reconstruction from happening, congressional Reconstruction. So there's troops down there enforcing everything, and you got the KKK, and you've got all this stuff going on. And then the Tenure of Office Act has to do with President Johnson, because President Johnson was really unpopular among those Republicans that wanted the South to change. Given that he was a Southerner, it's just kind of a fluke how he became president. We'll learn about that. But can you tell me what the Tenure of Office Act did? The people in Congress, they got control in Congress, and we call them the radical Republicans. They're like, they wanted Johnson down. They wanted to get Andrew Johnson. They wanted him out of office. So what did the Tenure of Office Act do? The Tenure of Office Act basically said that it required the consent of the Senate, the approval of the Senate for the president to remove a major official. So it required the approval of the U.S. Senate for the president to remove a major office holder. If the president wanted to fire one of his own officials, a major official, the Senate had to give its okay. Now the Senate has to confirm it. The Senate has to give it okay for appointments. But this said, if he wanted to get rid of someone, the Senate had to give him the okay. And the person they were trying to protect, the person they knew that Johnson hated, was Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. So the person they knew Johnson hated was Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who was a major supporter of congressional Reconstruction. He really wanted the South to change. He had been the Secretary of War during the Civil War. He wanted the South to change. And they were trying to protect him, and they kind of knew that Johnson was going to get rid of him. So Johnson eventually does so they basically say, you can't get rid of him, any major official, without the approval of the Senate. And then what happens on the next point is Johnson does get rid of Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War. And then he's impeached. He's impeached for violating the Tenure of Office Act. So Johnson does get rid of Edwin Stanton, and he's impeached for violating the Tenure of Office Act. And you should know what impeachment is. Impeachment is not to kick out of office. Impeachment is to accuse a government official of wrongdoing. Impeachment is to accuse a government official of wrongdoing and put him on trial. To accuse a government official of wrongdoing, high crimes and misdemeanors, and put them on trial. That's what impeachment is. And the House of Representatives is the only body in government that can impeach, and they did with a majority vote, and for violating the Tenure of Office Act. And then we want to know the result. Then there's a trial in the U.S. Senate. There's a trial in the U.S. Senate, and they needed 2/3 vote to find Johnson guilty and kick him out of office. Does anyone remember the results of the impeachment trial? The trial of the 19th century. Go ahead.
Weren't they one vote short?
They were one vote short of 2/3. They were one vote short of kicking him out of office. So he was allowed to, he stayed and served out his presidency. There's only been one other president that's been impeached, and that was Bill Clinton, who lied under oath about his having oral sex with Monica Lewinsky. Eventually they produced Monica Lewinsky's blue dress that gave evidence of the oral sex, and he had lied under oath, so he was basically put on trial in the Senate. They didn't even get close to 2/3 in the late 1990s. They didn't even get close to 2/3 to kick him off. This Johnson impeachment really made it hard, though, for impeachments to happen in the future, in the sense that they're saying, hey, it has to be for a pretty good reason. All right, moving on then to our last 2 points. 74, African American participation in government. During congressional Reconstruction, when they had the troops down there, large numbers of blacks got into the government. Large numbers of African Americans got elected into the government in the South. Large numbers of them in the South got elected into government. In fact, there were, 600 blacks Republicans in the state legislatures of the South, and there were 16 elected to Congress. So put over 600 African Americans elected to seats in the southern state legislatures, and 16 actually were elected to Congress, just a couple years after the war had ended. Could you also put down that the Republicans gained control of every single southern state government? The Republicans gained control of every single southern state government at the beginning of this congressional reconstruction. And then Robert Smalls, you should just know a story. Robert Smalls, you should just know that he was born as a slave in South Carolina. During the war, he escaped from slavery. And he brought 17, he basically, you don't have to put this down, but he commandeered a cotton steamer and basically took it over during the war, and he brought 17 black passengers with them, and they all escaped during the war. He escaped, and then he went on to serve in the South Carolina government, and then he served 5 terms in the House of Representatives. This is a real amazing story. He ended up serving in the South Carolina legislature, and then he served 5 terms in the House of Representatives for the United States, an escaped slave. And then finally, Republican Reconstruction governments. They did a lot of good things for the South, but they had one problem. And that problem was a great deal of waste and corruption. There was a great deal of waste and corruption leading to high debts and taxes. What do I mean by that? A lot of stealing taxpayer money and pocketing it. So these Republican governments were pretty corrupt. A lot of people were down there just to make money off of the situation. So there's a great deal of waste and corruption that led to high debts and taxes.